Hello, everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Morning Mile. From Marcus. The thing about driving long haul is that you see everything reflected in your mirrors, but most of the time you learn not to really look. The road behind you is just another piece of highway, another stretch of asphalt you've already conquered, and your mind focuses on what's ahead. But sometimes, late at night, when the diesel engine hums its steady rhythm and the yellow lines blur into a hypnotic dance, your eyes drift to that rectangular piece of glass mounted above your head, and you see things that make you question whether the road really ends where you left it. I've been driving this route between Phoenix and Albuquerque for 8 years now, hauling everything from furniture to electronics in my Peterbilt 379. She's an older model, forest green with chrome that I keep polished to a mirror shine, and she's never let me down. The cab smells like coffee and pine air freshener, and the CB radio crackles with the occasional trucker checking in from the darkness. It's a lonely job, but it's honest work, and the solitude has always suited me just fine. The night everything changed started like any other. I'd picked up a load of office equipment in Phoenix and was making good time toward Albuquerque, the speedometer holding steady at 70 on Interstate 40. The October air was crisp, and a light rain had started falling around midnight, creating that gentle percussion on the windshield that always made me drowsy. I had my thermos of black coffee wedged between the seats and an old country station playing low on the radio. Some forgotten ballad about lost love and empty highways. The rain was getting heavier as I approached a stretch of road I'd driven countless times before, a lonely piece of interstate that cuts through high desert country, where the only lights come from your own headlamps and the occasional passing truck. I was checking my mirrors, making sure I had clear space to pass a slower vehicle ahead, when I noticed something odd in my rear view. At first glance, it looked like another truck, maybe a quarter-mile back, but there was something different about its lights. Instead of the usual white headlights, this vehicle seemed to be emanating a soft, golden glow that reminded me of candlelight. I adjusted the mirror, thinking maybe the rain was playing tricks with the light, but the glow remained steady and warm. As I watched, more lights appeared behind the first vehicle, all with that same golden luminescence stretching back into the darkness like a string of amber beads. The sight was beautiful in a way that made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite place, something between wonder and unease. The radio had gone to static, and I reached over to find another station, but every frequency carried the same white noise, occasionally broken by what sounded like whispered voices too distant to understand. I turned it off and listened to the rain drumming against the cab, the steady thrum of the diesel engine, and underneath it all, something else. A low rhythmic sound that seemed to be coming from behind me, like the distant beating of a drum or the measured cadence of footsteps. I pressed my foot a little harder on the accelerator, not really sure why, but feeling suddenly anxious to put some distance between myself and whatever was following. The speedometer climbed to 75, then 80, but when I checked the rearview mirror again, the golden lights seemed no farther away. If anything, they appeared to be gaining ground, and now I could make out more details in that amber glow. The lead vehicle wasn't a truck at all. It was long and black, with an ornate design that reminded me of something from an old movie. Elegant and formal in a way that seemed completely out of place on a desert highway. Behind it followed other vehicles, all dark and stately, moving in perfect formation despite the rain and the challenging road conditions. As I watched, mesmerized despite my growing anxiety, I began to realize what I was seeing. It was a funeral procession. The lead vehicle was an antique hearse, its chrome fixtures gleaming in that supernatural golden light, followed by what must have been dozens of other cars, all dark and solemn, all maintaining that impossibly perfect spacing despite traveling at highway speed. I could see figures in the passenger seats of the closest cars, shadowy forms that sat perfectly still, facing forward with an unnatural uniformity that made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself it was just coincidence, that I'd simply encountered a funeral convoy traveling the same route. But nothing about what I was seeing made logical sense. Funeral processions don't travel at 80 miles per hour on interstate highways in the middle of the night. They don't glow with their own ethereal light. And they certainly don't seem to gain ground on vehicles that are actively trying to outrun them. The drumming sound was getting louder now, and I realized it wasn't coming from behind me at all. It was coming from all around me, as if the very air was vibrating with a slow, measured rhythm that reminded me of a dirge played on distant drums. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel, and I found myself checking the speedometer compulsively, watching it climb to 85, then 90, as I pushed the Peterbilt harder than I'd ever pushed her before. But the golden lights in my rearview mirror continued to gain ground, and now I could see more details that made my breath catch in my throat. The figures in the cars weren't quite right. They sat too still, their heads held at angles that suggested something was wrong with the way their necks were positioned. In the dim glow that surrounded the procession, I could see that some of the car windows were decorated with flowers, elaborate arrangements that seemed to be pressed against the glass from the inside. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just looking at a funeral procession. I was looking at a procession of the dead, vehicles carrying passengers who had no business traveling any earthly highway. The thought should have seemed ridiculous, should have been easy to dismiss as the product of too much coffee and too many lonely miles. But the evidence was right there in my mirror, getting closer with each passing second. I grabbed my CB radio and keyed the mic, desperate to hear another human voice to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind on this rain-soaked stretch of highway. Breaker, this is Desert Dog eastbound on 40. Anybody out there got ears on? My voice sounded strange in the confines of the cab, higher and more strained than usual. For a long moment, there was only static, and then a voice came through the speaker, clear and calm and utterly wrong. "We see you, Desert Dog. We've been waiting for you to join us." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something that existed in the spaces between those definitions, something that belonged to the place where living voices go to die. I dropped the mic as if it had burned my hand and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The Peterbilt responded with a surge of power that pushed me back in my seat, and the speedometer needle swept past 95 toward the red line. The engine roared with an intensity that should have been satisfying, should have given me confidence that I could outrun whatever was behind me. But the golden lights in my rearview mirror were now close enough that I could see individual details of the vehicles. The hearse was ornate beyond anything I'd ever seen, covered in carved decorations that seemed to move and shift in the golden light. The windshield was tinted so dark it was impossible to see who or what was driving, but flowers were pressed against the glass from the inside, elaborate funeral arrangements that completely obscured any view of the cab's interior. Behind it, the other vehicles in the procession had begun to spread out across all lanes of the highway, creating a wall of golden light and shadow that filled the entire width of the road. That's when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The procession wasn't just behind me anymore. Vehicles were pulling up alongside me in the left lane, matching my speed exactly. And when I dared to glance over through my side window, I could see the passengers clearly for the first time. They were dressed for a funeral, all of them, in dark suits and black dresses that looked like they hadn't been in style for decades. Their faces were pale and composed, hands folded in their laps, eyes staring straight ahead with the peaceful expression of people who had found their final rest. But they were traveling at nearly 100 miles per hour on a rain-slicked highway, sitting in cars that should have been crushing and tumbling, but instead glided along as smoothly as if they were floating on air. The woman in the passenger seat of the closest car turned her head slowly toward me, and I saw that her face was beautiful in the way that faces in old photographs are beautiful, timeless and serene and utterly lifeless. She smiled at me with lips that didn't quite match the color of living flesh, and raised one gloved hand in a gesture that could have been a greeting or a beckoning. The Blue Line Protocol, from Marcus Chen. The first time I noticed the blue paint, I thought it was some kind of new highway safety initiative. You know how the Department of Transportation is always trying something different. Reflective cat's eyes, rumble strips, those electronic message boards that tell you about construction 20 miles ahead. After 32 years hauling freight across the interstate system, I've seen them all come and go. But this blue paint was different. It didn't just reflect my headlights like the usual yellow lines. It seemed to glow from within, pulsing with a soft azure light that made the asphalt around it look black as deep water. I was driving my Peterbilt 379 eastbound on I-80 through Nevada that October night, pulling a load of electronics bound for Chicago. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides, nothing but sagebrush and darkness beyond the reach of my running lights. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, occasionally picking up fragments of Spanish-language broadcasts that faded in and out like voices calling across a vast canyon. My CB was equally useless, filled with white noise that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing. The only constant sound was the steady rumble of my Caterpillar engine and the whisper of wind around my cab. The blue line appeared just past mile marker 285, running parallel to the standard yellow center line. At first, I assumed it was some kind of experimental lane designation, maybe for autonomous vehicles or electric cars. California was always pushing some new environmental nonsense, and Nevada sometimes went along with their neighbors' schemes for federal funding. But as I followed the blue line deeper into the night, I began to notice oddities that made my scalp prickle beneath my baseball cap. The line didn't follow the natural curves of the highway. While the regular yellow stripes bent and dipped with the roadway's contours, the blue paint ran in perfectly straight segments, creating subtle but distinct angles where it rejoined the pavement's flow. It was as if someone had laid out the highway first, then painted the blue line according to entirely different specifications. The effect was subtle enough that I might not have noticed during daylight hours, but in the darkness with only my headlights to illuminate the road ahead, the geometric inconsistency became hypnotic and unsettling. Even stranger was the behavior of other vehicles. I passed several cars during that stretch of highway, and each time I noticed something peculiar. The drivers seemed to be following the blue line rather than the yellow center line, their vehicles tracking that eerie azure glow, even when it diverged slightly from the road's natural center. Their headlights cast the same pale illumination I remembered from my own beams, and none of them had their radios on. I could tell because there was no flicker of dashboard lights, no telltale glow of LED displays. They drove in complete darkness except for their headlights, following that blue line with mechanical precision. I tried switching to different CB channels, hoping to raise one of the other truckers I'd seen, but every frequency was filled with the same white noise breathing. The static seemed to pulse in rhythm with the blue line's glow, creating an unsettling synchronization that made me constantly adjust my grip on the steering wheel. My hands had begun to sweat despite the cool October air, and I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently, though I couldn't have said what I was looking for. The blue line continued for miles, leading me deeper into Nevada's high desert. The terrain began to change subtly around mile marker 310. Though the transformation was so gradual, I almost didn't notice it at first. The sagebrush gave way to strange, stunted trees that looked almost crystalline in my headlights. Their branches seemed to catch and hold the blue glow, creating an eerie network of azure veins spreading out from the highway into the darkness. The road surface itself began to change as well, taking on a smoother, almost glassy appearance that made my tires sing with a different pitch. I should have stopped. Every instinct honed by 3 decades of long-haul trucking was screaming at me to pull over, check my map, maybe catch a few hours of sleep at the next truck stop. But there was something about that blue line that made stopping seem impossible. It wasn't just that I felt compelled to follow it, though that was certainly part of the sensation. It was more like the line had become the only real thing in the world. the only source of certainty in an increasingly uncertain landscape. Everything else, the desert, the stars, even my own truck, felt vague and insubstantial compared to that steady azure glow. My fuel gauge read 3/4 full, but I couldn't remember the last time I'd filled up. The digital clock on my dashboard showed 2:17 a.m., though I was certain it had been showing 2:17 for at least the past hour. Distance markers continued to flash by in my peripheral vision, but I found I couldn't focus on them clearly enough to read the numbers. Only the blue line remained sharp and defined, pulling my attention forward like a river of light flowing across the endless asphalt. That's when I saw the facility. It appeared gradually, starting as a faint glow on the horizon that I initially mistook for a distant city, but as I drew closer, the light resolved into something far more unsettling. A massive complex of buildings rose from the desert floor, all gleaming white structures connected by elevated walkways and surrounded by enormous parking lots filled with vehicles. The blue line led directly toward the facility's main entrance, where I could see a series of toll booth-like structures spanning the highway. But it was the vehicles that made my blood run cold. Hundreds of cars, trucks, and motorcycles sat in perfect geometric rows throughout the parking areas, all facing the same direction. Their headlights were on, casting those same pale beams I'd grown accustomed to, but there was no movement anywhere, no people walking between the vehicles, no signs of life in the facility's windows, just that endless sea of motionless vehicles with their lights burning in the darkness. As I approached the toll plaza, I could see that the blue line split into multiple lanes, each leading to a different booth. Overhead signs displayed messages in that same blue glow, but the characters weren't English or Spanish or any language I recognized. They seemed to shift and change as I watched, forming patterns that hurt my eyes if I looked at them directly. The white noise on my CB was growing louder, and I began to make out what sounded like voices buried in the static. They seemed to be calling numbers or coordinates, or some kind of identification codes in that same unrecognizable language. I realized with growing horror that I was slowing down, my foot easing off the accelerator without any conscious decision on my part. The blue line seemed to be pulling my truck toward the rightmost toll booth, where a figure in white coveralls was emerging from the structure. In the glow of my headlights, I could see that the person wore a reflective helmet that completely obscured their face, and their movements had the same mechanical precision I'd observed in the other drivers. The figure raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a signal to stop, and I felt my truck responding to the gesture, my engine automatically downshifting as we approached the booth. The brake pedal seemed to depress itself beneath my foot, and I watched in helpless fascination as my speedometer needle dropped toward zero. The white-suited figure was walking toward my cab now, carrying what looked like a clipboard or electronic tablet, and I could hear their footsteps crunching on the strange, glassy surface of the roadway. That sound, the crunch of footsteps on that crystalline pavement, somehow cut through the hypnotic fog that had been clouding my mind for the past several hours. It was wrong. All of it was impossibly wrong, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, feeling my Caterpillar engine roar back to life as I yanked the steering wheel hard to the left. My truck lurched across the blue line and onto the regular yellow-painted asphalt of the far left lane, tires screaming in protest as I fought to regain control. The white-suited figure dropped their tablet and began running after my truck, moving with inhuman speed and coordination. In my side mirror, I could see them gaining ground with impossible strides, their reflective helmet turning to track my movement. I pushed my rig harder than I ever had before, watching my speedometer climb past 80, past 90, past the red line on my tachometer. The engine was screaming, but it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard because it was real. It was mine. It belonged to the world I knew and understood. Behind me, the facility was erupting into activity. Hundreds of headlights were turning toward the highway, and I could see vehicles beginning to pull out of their parking spaces with that same mechanical precision. The blue line was still there beside me, pulsing more rapidly now, almost frantically, as if trying to regain control of my truck. The Autumn Cache. From Marcus Holloway. The leaves started appearing in my sleeper cab on a Tuesday night somewhere outside Duluth, and I should have pulled over right then to figure out how they got there. Instead, I kept driving, listening to the steady thrum of my Peterbilt's engine as it carried 18 tons of appliances through the Minnesota darkness. The heater was working fine. All the windows were sealed tight against the October chill, and my cab had been spotless when I'd done my pre-trip inspection that morning. Yet there they were when I glanced back during a fuel stop, scattered across my bunk like someone had been playing in a pile of autumn leaves right there in my truck. They were beautiful leaves. I'll give them that. Perfect specimens of red maple and golden birch, crisp and whole without a single brown edge or tear. They looked like they'd been freshly fallen, still holding that rich earthy smell that comes with the first cold snap of the season. When I picked one up to examine it, the leaf felt substantial in my fingers, not brittle like you'd expect from something that had somehow made its way into a moving semi-trailer. The veins were intricate and delicate, and when I held it up to the dome light, it glowed like stained glass in a cathedral window. I swept them up and tossed them out at the truck stop, figuring maybe they'd blown in when I'd opened the door earlier, though I couldn't remember when that might have been. The night air was getting colder as I headed west on Highway 2, and I cranked up the heat a notch while classic rock played softly through my CB radio. The road stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated by my headlights cutting through patches of ground fog that drifted across the asphalt like ghostly fingers. It was the kind of peaceful drive I usually enjoyed. Just me and the highway and the gentle vibration of the road beneath my wheels. When I stopped for my mandatory rest break near Grand Rapids, the leaves were back. This time there were more of them, maybe 24 scattered across my sleeper like confetti after a parade. The same perfect specimens of maple and birch, the same fresh autumn smell filling the cab. I stared at them for a long moment, trying to work out the logistics of how leaves could possibly be getting into my truck. The sleeper compartment was sealed off from the outside world when the curtains were drawn, and I'd been driving with the windows closed and the vents recirculating interior air. There was no rational explanation for their presence. I gathered them up again, more carefully this time, noting how each leaf seemed to have its own personality. Some were broad and fan-shaped, others narrow and serrated along the edges. The colors ranged from deep burgundy to bright yellow, with every shade of orange and red in between. They felt real enough, substantial and slightly moist, like they'd just fallen from a tree. But there wasn't a tree in sight in the truck stop parking lot, just asphalt and diesel pumps and the harsh white glare of sodium vapor lights reflecting off the wet pavement. After dumping the leaves in a trash container, I did a thorough inspection of my cab, checking every seal and window latch, running my hands along the edges of the sleeper compartment looking for gaps or holes where leaves might be entering. Everything was tight and secure. I even climbed underneath to check the frame and floor, thinking maybe there was a breach in the cab's undercarriage, but found nothing unusual. My Peterbilt was solid and well-maintained, without so much as a loose bolt or worn gasket. The next morning brought gray skies and a light drizzle as I rolled through the lake country of northern Minnesota. The wipers swept rhythmically across the windshield, and I had the defroster running to keep the glass clear. I had managed a decent night's sleep despite the mystery of the leaves, and daylight had a way of making strange things seem less threatening. Probably just some freak occurrence, I told myself. Maybe something to do with the air pressure differential when I opened and closed the doors. Trucks were complex machines, and sometimes they did odd things that had perfectly reasonable explanations. But when I checked the sleeper after my afternoon break, the leaves were there again. Dozens of them this time, covering nearly every inch of the bunk. They looked exactly like the previous ones. The same species and colors. The same fresh appearance that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The smell was stronger now, too. A rich, loamy fragrance that reminded me of walking through forests in October, kicking through piles of fallen leaves while the trees overhead rustled in the wind. I started taking pictures with my phone, documenting the phenomenon in case I needed to file some kind of maintenance report or insurance claim, though what exactly I'd claim I wasn't sure. Spontaneous leaf manifestation wasn't covered under any warranty I'd ever heard of. The photos looked exactly like what I was seeing, proof that I wasn't hallucinating or suffering from road fatigue. The leaves were real, they were in my truck, and they were multiplying. As evening approached and I prepared to bed down for the night in a rest area near the Wisconsin border, I decided to leave the leaves where they were. Maybe if I didn't disturb them, if I just worked around them somehow, I could figure out their source. I pulled the curtains closed and settled onto the narrow strip of bunk that wasn't covered in foliage, listening to the rain pattering against the cab roof and the occasional hiss of air brakes from other trucks in the parking area. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling sound barely audible above the ambient noise of the truck stop. At first I thought it might be the leaves shifting as the truck settled on its suspension, but the sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful. It reminded me of someone walking through a forest floor covered in autumn leaves, that distinctive crunching and whispering sound that comes with each footstep. Except there was no one walking anywhere near my truck. I lay still and listened, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from the leaves themselves, as if they were moving of their own accord. When I turned on the dome light and looked closely, I could swear I saw them shifting slightly, rearranging themselves in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. A cluster of red maples would drift toward the head of the bunk, while yellow birch leaves gathered near the foot, like they were organizing themselves according to some plan I couldn't understand. The rustling continued through the night, sometimes soft and barely perceptible, other times loud enough to wake me from the edge of sleep. I started to notice a rhythm to it, a cadence that reminded me of breathing or maybe a heartbeat. The leaves would be still for long periods, then suddenly come alive with movement, shifting and turning as if stirred by an invisible wind. The smell grew stronger too, evolving from pleasant autumn fragrance to something deeper and more complex, with undertones of earth and decay that hadn't been there before. By morning, the leaves had formed distinct patterns across my bunk, spirals and geometric shapes that looked almost like symbols or writing in some language I didn't recognize. When I tried to photograph them, the camera seemed to have trouble focusing, producing blurry images that didn't capture the intricate designs I could see clearly with my naked eye. I sketched what I could in a notebook I kept for logging miles and expenses, trying to document the phenomenon even though I doubted anyone would believe what I was seeing. The day brought no relief from the mystery. If anything, the leaves seemed to be spreading beyond the sleeper compartment now. I found them on the passenger seat, scattered across the dashboard, even tucked into the sun visor pockets. They appeared to be multiplying exponentially, and I began to worry about what would happen when they filled the entire cab. Would they interfere with my ability to drive safely? Would they clog the air vents or get caught in the steering mechanism? As I rolled through northern Wisconsin that afternoon, the autumn landscape outside my window seemed to mirror what was happening inside the truck. The trees were at peak color, their leaves blazing in shades that matched exactly what I was finding in my cab. I began to feel like I was driving through some kind of parallel world, where the boundary between interior and exterior was breaking down, where the forest was slowly claiming my truck from the inside out. That evening, parked at a truck stop near Superior, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to sleep in the leaf-filled cab, I booked a room at a nearby motel and locked the truck up tight. Through the motel window, I could see my Peterbilt sitting under the parking lot lights, looking normal and solid from the outside, but I knew what was happening inside. Could almost sense the leaves continuing their mysterious multiplication even from a distance. When I returned to the truck the next morning, I found the cab completely filled with leaves from floor to ceiling. They pressed against the windows like living things seeking escape, and when I opened the driver's door, hundreds of them spilled out onto the asphalt in a cascading waterfall of color. The smell that emerged was overwhelming, a concentrated essence of autumn forest that made my head spin and my vision. The Mirror Mile, from Jake Harrison. The CB radio crackled with static as I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel of my weathered Kenworth, watching the hypnotic dance of raindrops cascade down the windshield in the amber glow of passing streetlights. It was well past midnight on Interstate 80, somewhere between the Nebraska cornfields and the Iowa border, where the world narrows down to nothing but the steady thrum of diesel engine and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching into darkness. I'd been driving this route for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from furniture to farming equipment, and I thought I knew every truck stop, every curve, every lonely stretch of highway by heart. The rain had been falling steadily for the past hour, creating a cocoon of sound around my cab that made the outside world feel distant and dreamlike. My headlights cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating the reflective strips on the guardrails that flicked past like a metronome keeping time with my thoughts. The cargo behind me, 20 tons of agricultural machinery bound for Des Moines, shifted slightly as I navigated a gentle curve, the familiar weight of it settling with a soft metallic whisper that had become as comforting as a lullaby over the years. That's when I first noticed the other truck in my mirrors. At first, it was just another set of headlights in the distance. Nothing unusual about that on a major interstate, even at this hour. But as the minutes passed and the miles rolled beneath my wheels, those lights maintained their position with an almost mathematical precision. Not gaining, not falling back, just there, like a faithful shadow trailing through the rain-soaked night. I adjusted my rearview mirror and squinted through the glare, trying to make out details of the vehicle behind me. The headlights were positioned exactly like mine, the same height and spacing that you'd expect from a Kenworth. Even the slight yellowish tint to the beams looked familiar, the way older halogen bulbs take on that warm color after years of service. I'd been meaning to upgrade to LEDs myself, but there was something comforting about that old-fashioned glow, like the difference between candlelight and fluorescent tubes. My CB radio suddenly burst to life with a voice that made me nearly swerve into the next lane. It was my own voice, speaking the exact words I'd been thinking just moments before about upgrading those headlights. The transmission was slightly distorted by static, the way radio signals sometimes bounce off atmospheric layers in the deep hours of night. But there was no mistaking the inflection, the slight rasp I'd developed from too many years of truck stop coffee and highway dust. Breaker 19. This is Jake Harrison eastbound on I-80. Mile marker 215, the voice continued, and I felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. I hadn't keyed my radio. My hand was nowhere near the microphone, yet here was my voice broadcasting into the night, calling out my exact location with casual precision. I grabbed the microphone with trembling fingers and pressed the talk button. This is Jake Harrison. Who is this? You're on my frequency. The words came out rougher than I intended, edged with confusion and growing unease. The only response was the gentle hiss of static, punctuated by the occasional pop and crackle of electrical interference from the storm rolling overhead. The truck behind me maintained its steady pace, neither approaching nor retreating, like a patient hunter content to follow its prey through the endless night. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the big Cummins engine respond with a deeper growl, watching my speedometer climb past 75. The headlights in my mirror never wavered, never fell back, maintaining that same impossible distance despite my increased speed. A memory surfaced from my childhood, something my grandmother used to tell me about mirrors and reflections. She'd grown up in the rural mountains of West Virginia, where folklore ran as deep as the coal seams, and she always insisted that mirrors at night were doorways to places that looked like our world, but weren't quite right. Never trust what you see in glass after midnight, she'd whisper, her weathered hands adjusting my blankets. Sometimes what looks back ain't really you. I'd dismiss those stories as the superstitions of an old woman who'd grown up without electricity or running water. But now, racing through the Iowa darkness with my own voice echoing from the CB and my own headlights following in my mirrors, I found myself wishing I'd paid more attention to her warnings. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice was having a conversation with someone I couldn't hear. It was definitely my voice, but discussing things I'd never said, talking about routes I'd never driven and loads I'd never hauled. "Yeah, I remember that run to Portland back in 18, the voice was saying, when that kid appeared in my passenger seat. Looked just like me when I was 5 years old. Strangest thing you ever did see." I had never made a run to Portland in 2018. I'd been exclusively Midwest routes that entire year due to my father's illness, barely leaving a 3-state area. But the voice continued with perfect confidence, describing details of a trip that had never happened, speaking to some invisible companion about experiences that belonged to a life I'd never lived. That's when I made the mistake of looking directly into my passenger side mirror instead of the rear view. The angle was different, catching the interior of the cab behind me, and for just a moment I saw something that made my heart skip like a scratched record. There was a figure in the passenger seat of that trailing truck, small and indistinct in the darkness, but with a posture and silhouette that triggered a deep, primal recognition. I fumbled for the dome light, suddenly desperately needing to illuminate my own cab, to prove to myself that I was alone with my cargo and my growing fear. The sudden brightness made me blink, my night vision temporarily shattered. But in that brief moment of adjustment, I heard something that nearly sent me off the road entirely. A small voice, high and clear, speaking from the passenger seat beside me. "Are you really me when I grow up?" it asked, and I turned to see myself at 5 years old, still wearing the red striped shirt and denim overalls I remembered from old family photographs, my hair still that impossible shade of golden blonde it had been before darkening to brown in my teenage years. The child that had been me was studying my face with the intense curiosity that only 5-year-olds possess, those wide eyes taking in every line and weathermark that 43 years of living had etched into my features. "You look tired," he observed with the brutal honesty of childhood. "And sad. Are you sad because of the scary truck following us?" I wanted to speak, to ask him how he was here, to demand explanations that made sense in a world where diesel engines and CB radios and cargo manifests were real, solid things you could touch and measure. But my voice had abandoned me entirely, leaving only the sound of my labored breathing and the steady percussion of rain against the windshield. The child version of myself turned to look back through the rear window of the cab, his small face pressing against the glass with fearless curiosity. "He's getting closer," he announced matter-of-factly. "The other you. The one that's not really you but looks just like you do now. He's been following us for a long time, hasn't he?" I forced myself to look in the rearview mirror again, and the trailing truck was indeed closer now, close enough that I could make out the shape of the cab, the configuration of the running lights, even the small crack in the windshield that ran along the passenger side exactly like the one in my own truck. The driver was clearly visible now, and he was wearing the same flannel shirt I had on, the same worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. But there was something wrong with his face, something that my mind struggled to process even as my eyes registered the details. It was my face, but flattened somehow like a photograph that had been pressed under glass for too long, or a reflection seen in water that was almost but not quite still. The features were all correct, positioned properly, but lacking the subtle imperfections and asymmetries that make a real face human. "He wants to trade places," the 5-year-old me said conversationally, still watching the approaching truck with the detached interest of a child observing insects. "He's tired of following the roads that don't go anywhere. He wants to drive real roads with real cargo and talk to real people on the radio." The CB suddenly roared to life with multiple voices, all variations of my own, speaking in overlapping conversations that created a cacophony of my own thoughts and words echoing back at me from different times, different possibilities. Some were discussing loads I'd hauled years ago, others talking about routes I'd never taken, and one was having an animated conversation about a wife and children I'd never had, describing their names and ages with loving detail. The giggling load from Marcus Wheeler. The first time I heard it, I thought maybe the radio had picked up some late-night comedy show bleeding through the static. You know how it is on those long hauls through the Nevada desert, when the darkness stretches out like black velvet and the only company you have is the steady thrum of your diesel engine and whatever scratchy signals your CB can pull from the ether. I was driving my 18 Peterbilt, pulling a standard dry van from Reno to Phoenix. Nothing unusual about the load except for the paperwork that simply listed the contents as novelty items ends with a pickup from some warehouse on the industrial side of town that I'd never seen before. The warehouse itself had been unremarkable, one of those corrugated metal buildings that could have housed anything from auto parts to Christmas decorations. The loading dock crew worked in unusual silence, their faces hidden under the brims of baseball caps pulled low, and they moved with an efficiency that spoke of wanting to get the job done quickly. I'd helped guide the forklift operator as he positioned the pallets, each one wrapped tight in black plastic sheeting that revealed nothing of what lay beneath. The manifest showed 47 boxes, each weighing roughly the same, distributed evenly throughout the trailer to maintain proper balance. It wasn't until I was 3 hours into the drive, somewhere between Fallon and Hawthorne where the highway cuts through miles of scrubland, and the nearest town is just a memory in your rearview mirror, that I first noticed the sound. At first it was so faint I convinced myself it was just the wind whistling through some small gap in the trailer seals, or maybe the way my tires were singing against the asphalt. But as the miles rolled by and the night deepened around me like a closing fist, the sound became more distinct, more unmistakably what it was. Laughter. Not the hearty laughter of friends sharing a joke, or even the practiced laughter of television comedians, but something else entirely. It was high and thin, like the giggling of children, but with an edge to it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The sound seemed to ebb and flow with the rhythm of the road, growing louder when I hit bumps or took curves, then fading to almost nothing on the straight stretches where the trailer rode smooth and steady behind me. I pulled over at a truck stop outside of Hawthorne, one of those 24-hour places where the neon signs buzz like angry insects, and the fluorescent lights inside cast everything in a sickly green glow. The attendant was a thin man with hollow cheeks who looked like he hadn't seen sunlight in years, and when I mentioned hearing sounds from my trailer, he just shrugged and said sometimes loads settle funny, make all kinds of noises. He sold me a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration, and wished me safe travels with a smile that never reached his eyes. Back in the cab, I sat for a moment in the relative quiet, engine idling, listening. The truck stop's neon sign flickered intermittently, casting red and blue shadows across my windshield, and I could hear the distant hum of other trucks coming and going on the highway. But from my trailer, nothing. Just the normal creaks and sighs of a loaded rig settling on its suspension. I began to think maybe the attendant was right. Maybe it had just been the load shifting, metal rubbing against metal in ways that the tired mind could interpret as something more sinister. But 20 minutes back on the road, it started again. This time there was no mistaking it for wind or tires or settling cargo. It was definitely laughter. Dozens of voices giggling and chuckling in overlapping waves that rose and fell like a twisted symphony. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, not just from behind me in the trailer but from all around, as if the cab itself was filled with invisible audience members enjoying some private joke at my expense. I tried turning up the radio, spinning through AM and FM frequencies, hoping to drown out the sound with music or talk radio or even static. But every station I found seemed wrong somehow. The music too slow or too fast. The voices of talk show hosts stretched and distorted like records played at the wrong speed. And underneath it all, threading through whatever frequencies I managed to tune in, was that constant backdrop of giggling, as if it was being broadcast on every wavelength simultaneously. The miles crawled by with agonizing slowness. I found myself checking my mirrors obsessively, half expecting to see something impossible in the darkness behind me. Some sign that my trailer had split open and released whatever was producing those sounds into the Nevada night. But each time I looked, there was nothing but the familiar rectangle of my trailer, its running lights blinking steadily, its bulk following obediently behind me as it had on hundreds of other runs. Near Tonopah, I pulled into another truck stop, this one smaller and more run down than the last. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few other rigs whose drivers were presumably catching some sleep in their sleeper cabs. I grabbed a flashlight from my glove compartment and walked back to inspect my trailer, my boots crunching on gravel that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert silence. The trailer doors were still sealed with the same tamper-evident locks that had been applied at the warehouse, their plastic tags intact and showing no signs of being disturbed. I walked around the entire perimeter of the trailer, running my hands along the aluminum walls, checking for any gaps or damage that might explain how sound could be escaping from what should have been a sealed container. But the trailer was solid, well maintained, with no obvious flaws in its construction. Standing there in the desert darkness, surrounded by the vast emptiness of Nevada and the distant mountains that rose like sleeping giants against the star-filled sky, I pressed my ear against the side of the trailer and listened. At first there was nothing, just the sound of my own heartbeat and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. But then, so faint I might have imagined it, came the sound again, soft giggling as if whatever was inside knew I was listening and found my concern amusing. I jerked away from the trailer wall as if it had given me an electric shock. The rational part of my mind, the part that had been driving trucks for 15 years and had seen every kind of cargo from live animals to hazardous chemicals, tried to provide reasonable explanations. Maybe the boxes contained some kind of electronic devices that had activated somehow. Toys or novelty items with sound chips that were malfunctioning. Maybe the vibration of the road had damaged whatever was inside, causing it to produce these bizarre sounds. But the irrational part of my mind, the part that remembered childhood fears of things that laughed in the darkness, whispered that this was something else entirely. Something that should not be transported down America's highways in the dead of night, sealed in boxes and loaded onto trucks driven by unsuspecting drivers who thought they were just making another routine delivery. I climbed back into the cab and tried to call dispatch, but my phone showed no signal bars. The radio crackled with static when I tried to raise other drivers on the CB, as if some kind of interference was blocking normal communications. I was alone with whatever was in my trailer, alone on a dark highway with hundreds of miles still to go before I reached Phoenix. The laughter grew louder as I drove south through the night, no longer just giggling but full-throated laughter that seemed to shake the entire truck. It came in waves, sometimes building to crescendos that made my teeth ache, other times dropping to barely audible chuckles that were somehow more unnerving than the louder outbursts. I began to notice patterns in the laughter, as if different voices were taking turns, some high and childlike, others deeper and more mature, all of them sharing in some cosmic joke that I couldn't understand. Near the California border, something changed. The laughter began to sound more organized, more purposeful, as if whatever was producing it was trying to communicate. I thought I could hear my name mixed in with the giggling syllables that might have been Marcus, stretched and distorted but still recognizable. The sound seemed to be coming not just from the trailer now, but from inside the cab itself, from the vents and speakers and even from the walls around me. I pulled over on a dark stretch of highway where the desert pressed close on both sides and there were no lights except for my own. Headlights cutting through the blackness ahead. The engine idled roughly, as if even the truck itself was affected by whatever was happening in the trailer behind me. I sat there trying to decide what to do, whether to abandon the load or try to complete the delivery, when I heard new sounds mixing with the laughter, scratching sounds, as if whatever was in those boxes was trying to get out. The scratching grew more intense, accompanied by what sounded like cardboard tearing and plastic rustling. I imagined the contents of those boxes working their way free, whatever they were. preparing to emerge from their packaging like some twisted version of a birthday party where the gifts unwrap themselves. The Hunger Road, from Marcus Chen. I've been hauling freight across the continental United States for 15 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the highway had to offer. Dead deer at 3 in the morning, fog so thick you could cut it with a knife, ice storms that turned the interstate into a skating rink. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on that stretch of Highway 50 through Nevada last October. I was driving a 2018 Peterbilt 579, 26 feet of gleaming chrome and diesel power that I'd bought used from a lot in Bakersfield. The previous owner was an older gentleman named Earl Hutchins, a weathered man with eyes that seemed to hold secrets he wasn't willing to share. When I asked him about the truck's history, he just smiled and said it was special, that it would take good care of me on the long hauls. The price was too good to pass up, nearly $30,000 below market value, and Earl seemed eager to get rid of it. I should have wondered why. The first thing I noticed was how smooth she ran. The engine purred like a contented cat, never missing a beat, never struggling up the steepest grades. I'd driven plenty of trucks in my day, but this one felt alive somehow, responsive to my every thought before I even touched the controls. The fuel gauge became my favorite feature because it barely moved, even on 1,000-mile runs. I figured Earl had done some serious modifications to the engine, maybe installed some kind of experimental fuel injection system that maximized efficiency. For months, everything was perfect. I was making more money than ever because my fuel costs were practically non-existent. The truck seemed to know exactly where I wanted to go, the GPS becoming almost unnecessary as she guided me along routes I'd never taken before, shortcuts that somehow always got me to my destination ahead of schedule. My dispatcher started calling me the miracle driver, and other truckers at the stops would ask about my secret. I'd just smile and tap the side of my nose, enjoying the mystery of it all. The first sign something was wrong came on a haul from Denver to Portland in late September. I'd been driving for about 6 hours when I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. Highway 80 is usually busy, even in the middle of the night, but the road stretched empty in both directions like a black ribbon through the darkness. The fuel gauge, which had been sitting at 3/4 full when I left Denver, was now completely full. The needle pushed so far to the right it was touching the edge of the display. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a lonely place called Desert Rose with flickering neon signs and pumps that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1980s. When I popped the hood to check the engine, everything appeared normal, but there was something else, something I couldn't quite identify. The engine block was warm, but not hot like it should have been after 6 hours of driving. It felt almost cool to the touch, and there was no smell of diesel exhaust, no residual fumes clinging to the metal. The attendant, a thin man with hollow cheeks and nervous eyes, approached me as I stood there staring at the engine. He looked at my truck with an expression I couldn't read, something between fear and recognition. When I asked him if he'd ever seen anything like it before, he just shook his head quickly and walked away, but not before I heard him mutter something under his breath that sounded like, "Not again." I tried to dismiss these strange occurrences as coincidence, maybe some kind of experimental engine technology I wasn't familiar with. But deep down, I knew something fundamental had changed about my truck. The way she moved through the night felt different now, less like driving and more like being carried by something with its own agenda. The steering wheel would sometimes adjust course on its own, just slightly, guiding me toward exits I hadn't planned to take or keeping me in the left lane when I intended to move right. The night everything came together was October 15th. I was hauling a load of electronics from Las Vegas to Sacramento, taking Highway 50 through the heart of Nevada. The locals call it the loneliest road in America, and on that particular night it lived up to its reputation. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, and the desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the asphalt, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional abandoned gas station. Around 2 a.m., I noticed the fuel gauge was doing something impossible. Instead of decreasing as I drove, it was slowly climbing. The needle moving from half full to 3/4, then to completely full, and finally pushing beyond the maximum marker into territory that shouldn't have existed. The engine's purr had taken on a different quality too, almost like breathing. A rhythmic inhale and exhale that seemed to match the rise and fall of the desert wind. That's when I saw the lights in my rearview mirror. At first I thought it was another truck approaching from behind, but as the lights grew closer, I realized they were moving too slowly, gliding rather than traveling at highway speed. They weren't headlights either, but something softer, more organic, like the glow of bioluminescent creatures in the deep ocean. The lights pulsed in a pattern that seemed almost communicative, and my truck began to slow down without my foot touching the brake pedal. I tried to accelerate, pressing the gas pedal to the floor, but the truck continued to decelerate until we were crawling along at maybe 15 miles per hour. The lights behind me had resolved into shapes now, indistinct figures that seemed to float just above the asphalt. They were keeping pace with my truck, surrounding it on all sides like an escort or a hunting party. The engine's breathing had become more pronounced, and I could feel vibrations through the steering wheel that reminded me of a heartbeat. The fuel gauge was now completely off the scale. The needle bent at an impossible angle, and I finally understood what Earl Hutchins had sold me. This wasn't a truck with an efficient engine or experimental fuel system. This was something that had learned to feed on the road itself, on the endless miles of asphalt and the dreams of drivers who spent their lives chasing horizons they would never reach. The truck wasn't using diesel because it had found something better, something more nourishing. The floating lights began to converge on my truck, and I could see them more clearly now. They were the shapes of other drivers, translucent figures still wearing their trucking caps and flannel shirts, their eyes glowing with the same soft bioluminescence. Some looked familiar, faces I'd seen at truck stops and diners, drivers who had simply disappeared one day, leaving behind stories of mysterious engine troubles and vehicles that were never found. I realized with growing horror that my truck was collecting them, drawing sustenance from their essence while their bodies remained trapped in some liminal space between the highway and eternity. The engine didn't need fuel because it had found something far more potent, the life force of men and women who had given their souls to the open road. Earl Hutchins hadn't been selling me a truck. He'd been passing along a responsibility he could no longer bear, transferring ownership of something that had evolved beyond mechanical engineering into pure predatory instinct. The nearest figure drifted close enough that I could see his face clearly. His mouth moved as if he was speaking, but no sound penetrated the truck's cabin. His expression was one of desperate warning, and he gestured frantically toward something ahead of us on the highway. I followed his pointing finger and saw what looked like a rest area. But as we approached, I realized it was something else entirely. A place where the asphalt seemed to dissolve into swirling patterns of light and shadow. My truck was steering toward this anomaly with increasing speed, the engine's breathing becoming rapid and excited. I fought against the wheel, pulling with all my strength to keep us on the straight path of the highway. But the truck's desire was stronger than my resistance. The fuel gauge was vibrating now, the needle spinning wildly as if measuring something that couldn't be quantified by normal instruments. In a moment of desperate inspiration, I reached for the CB radio and began broadcasting on Channel 19, calling out to any driver within range. The response was immediate, a chorus of voices from truckers scattered across the western states. I told them my location and situation, asking them to converge on Highway 50, to bring lights and noise and the presence of other living souls. Something about their voices seemed to confuse my truck, the engine's breathing becoming erratic as it encountered interference from the outside world. The floating figures began to retreat as the first set of real headlights appeared on the horizon behind us. My truck shuddered and fought against whatever force was pulling it toward the dissolving asphalt, and gradually I felt control returning to the steering wheel. The fuel gauge stopped its wild spinning and slowly settled back to a normal reading, showing nearly empty for the first time since I'd owned the vehicle. I managed to guide the truck to a legitimate rest area 20 miles down the highway, where I sat in the parking lot surrounded by other drivers who had responded to my CB call. The breathing floor, from Marcus. The interstate stretched endlessly before me that October night, my Kenworth's headlights cutting through the darkness like twin blades through black velvet. I'd been hauling freight for 23 years, and in all that time I'd never experienced anything quite like what happened on that run from Phoenix to Denver. The cargo manifest listed standard commercial goods, nothing unusual, nothing that should have made my trailer floor behave the way it did, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, when the first strange vibration traveled up through my seat just past the Colorado border. The rain had started an hour earlier, a gentle pattering that gradually intensified until it drummed steadily against my windshield. My wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm, and the CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers navigating the storm. The load felt balanced, the weight distribution seeming normal as I'd secured everything that afternoon in Phoenix. The shipper had been professional, efficient, loading pallets of what appeared to be industrial equipment wrapped in heavy canvas. Nothing had seemed amiss then, and I'd pulled away from the dock with the same confidence I'd felt on thousands of other runs. But somewhere around midnight, as I climbed through the mountain passes with my engine working harder against the grade, I began to notice something peculiar. The trailer felt different, not in the way a shifting load might feel, but something more subtle, more organic. It was as if the very floor beneath my cargo was moving, expanding and contracting in a slow rhythmic pattern that defied explanation. At first I dismissed it as fatigue playing tricks on my perception, but the sensation grew stronger with each passing mile. I pulled into a truck stop near Glenwood Springs to check my load, the neon lights of the facility casting an eerie glow through the rain-soaked parking lot. Walking around to the back of my trailer, I could hear something that made my blood run cold. It was a sound like breathing, a slow, deep inhalation followed by an equally deliberate exhalation, coming from within the trailer itself. The sound was barely audible over the rain and the distant hum of idling engines, but it was unmistakably there, regular as a heartbeat. I fumbled with the lock on the trailer doors, my hands trembling slightly from what I told myself was just the cold mountain air. When the doors finally swung open, the interior looked exactly as I'd left it hours earlier. The pallets were still secured, the straps still tight, nothing visibly disturbed. But the floor, that 40-foot expanse of aluminum and wood planking, seemed to undulate ever so slightly, rising and falling in gentle waves that traveled from front to back in a mesmerizing pattern. Standing there in the doorway, rain dripping from my jacket, I watched in fascination and growing horror as the floor swelled upward in the center, creating a hump perhaps 6 inches high that slowly traveled toward the rear doors before subsiding. Then, moments later, the same section would sink downward, creating a depression that seemed impossibly deep given the structural limitations of a standard trailer floor. The cargo above remained perfectly stable, as if the pallets were somehow floating independently of the surface beneath them. I climbed into the trailer, my boots echoing hollowly on the metal surface, and knelt down to examine the phenomenon more closely. The floor felt solid enough under my weight, but I could sense the movement continuing around me, a gentle swelling and sinking that created the unmistakable impression of something alive beneath the surface. The breathing sound was much more pronounced inside the trailer, surrounding me with its steady rhythm until I began to feel lightheaded from the strangeness of it all. My flashlight beam played across the floor, revealing nothing unusual in the construction or materials, yet the movement continued unabated. I pressed my ear to the surface and heard something that nearly made me bolt from the trailer. Deep below, muffled by layers of metal and wood, came the sound of what could only be described as a massive heart beating. The rhythm matched the floor's movement perfectly, each beat coinciding with another gentle rise and fall of the surface beneath me. I called my dispatcher from the truck stop, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained that I might have a structural issue with the trailer. But how do you tell someone that your cargo floor is breathing? How do you explain that you can hear a heartbeat coming from beneath 40 feet of what should be inanimate construction materials? The dispatcher suggested I continue to Denver if the load seemed secure, and after another inspection that revealed no obvious safety hazards, I reluctantly climbed back into my cab. The next 100 miles were the longest of my driving career. The breathing floor seemed to grow more active as we traveled through the night, the swells becoming more pronounced, the depressions deeper. I could feel each undulation through the connection between trailer and tractor, a gentle rocking motion that was almost hypnotic in its regularity. The rain continued to fall, creating a symphony of natural and unnatural sounds that filled my cab with an atmosphere of mounting dread. Near Vale, the phenomenon intensified dramatically. The floor began moving in complex patterns with multiple waves traveling in different directions simultaneously. Through my mirrors, I could see the trailer's sides bulging outward slightly with each major swell, as if some enormous creature trapped beneath the floor was testing the limits of its confinement. The breathing sound grew louder, more labored, and I began to worry that whatever was causing this impossible situation might be preparing for something more dramatic than gentle undulations. Tried changing radio stations to distract myself from the growing panic, but static filled most frequencies, broken only by occasional fragments of voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The storm seemed to be intensifying as well, with lightning beginning to flicker in the distance and thunder rolling across the mountain peaks. My headlights illuminated sheets of rain that fell in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the weather itself was responding to whatever was happening in my trailer. As I crested a particularly steep grade, the floor suddenly went completely still. The breathing stopped, the undulation ceased, and for a moment I dared to hope that whatever strange occurrence I'd been experiencing had finally ended. But then, without warning, the entire trailer bucked upward with tremendous force, lifting the rear wheels of my tractor completely off the ground for a terrifying instant before slamming back down with a crash that shook every bolt and rivet in my rig. I fought to maintain control as the trailer continued to buck and heave, the floor now moving with violent urgency rather than gentle rhythm. Through my mirrors, I watched in horror as the trailer's roof began to bulge upward, the metal groaning and creaking under impossible stress. Steam began rising from around the trailer's edges, visible even through the heavy rain, carrying with it a smell like hot metal and something organic, something alive. The bucking intensified, and I realized with growing terror that I needed to get the trailer disconnected before whatever was happening inside broke free completely. I pulled into the first wide spot I could find, a scenic overlook that was mercifully deserted at this hour, and began the process of unhitching while the trailer continued its violent convulsions behind me. The kingpin release seemed to take forever, my hands shaking as I worked the handle while the entire assembly lurched and twisted. Just as I managed to free my tractor from the trailer, the movement stopped again as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the violent motion had been. I sat in my cab, engine idling, staring at the now motionless trailer through rain-streaked mirrors while my heart hammered against my ribs. The storm continued around us, but the trailer sat perfectly still, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. I waited there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, afraid to approach the trailer but knowing I couldn't simply abandon it on a mountain highway. When I finally worked up the courage to check the cargo area again, I found everything exactly as I'd loaded it hours earlier. The floor was perfectly level, solid as any normal trailer floor, showing no signs of the impossible movements I'd witnessed. The pallets were still properly secured, nothing had shifted, and the breathing sound had completely disappeared. But as I stood there in the doorway, rain soaking through my jacket, I noticed something that made my blood run cold once more. Carved into the floor in letters nearly 2 feet tall were words that definitely hadn't been there when I'd loaded the cargo. The inscription was shallow but clearly deliberate, as if burned into the metal by intense heat. It read simply, "Thank you for the ride. I completed the delivery to Denver without further incident, though I drove the final 100 miles in a state of nervous exhaustion that left me jumping at every normal road noise. The consignee accepted the cargo without comment, and their inspection revealed nothing unusual about the freight or the trailer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been used somehow, that my truck had served as transportation for something that had needed to travel from Phoenix to Colorado, but couldn't manage the journey on its own. I never hauled a load from that particular shipper again, despite several lucrative offers over the following months. The last space. From Marcus. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight when I finally saw the glow of the truck stop sign cutting through the darkness ahead. My 18-wheeler's wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, and the rhythmic thump-thump of rubber against glass had become a hypnotic soundtrack to my growing exhaustion. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 in the morning, and my bones ached from the long haul down Interstate 40 through the heart of Arkansas. I'd been driving for 11 hours, pushing the legal limit, and sleep was no longer a luxury but a necessity. The truck stop appeared gradually through the rain-soaked windshield, its neon lights reflecting off the wet asphalt like watercolors bleeding into black paper. As I downshifted and felt the familiar rumble of my Peterbilt's engine dropping to a lower gear, I could make out the outline of the main building, a typical roadside establishment with its promise of hot coffee, questionable food, and most importantly, a place to rest. The fuel pumps stood like sentinels in the night, their harsh fluorescent lights creating pools of artificial daylight in the surrounding darkness. But it was the parking area that caught my attention and sent the first whisper of unease through my chest. In all my years of long-haul trucking from coast to coast and border to border, I had never encountered a truck stop with only one parking space. Yet there it was, a single painted rectangle of white lines on dark asphalt, positioned oddly at the far end of the lot, isolated from the main building and the fuel station. The space was empty, waiting, almost beckoning in the strange way that vacant places sometimes do in the deep hours of the night. I pulled my rig around the building slowly, searching for additional parking that surely had to exist. Perhaps there was another lot behind the main structure, or maybe the rain was obscuring other spaces. But as my headlights swept across the wet pavement, illuminating every corner and shadow, the reality became undeniable. One space, just one, and it was perfectly positioned for an 18-wheeler, as if it had been designed specifically for trucks despite being solitary in its purpose. The fuel gauge on my dashboard hovered near empty, and my eyelids felt heavy as lead curtains threatening to fall. I had no choice but to accept this strange arrangement. I maneuvered my truck toward the lone space, feeling a peculiar sensation as I did so, as if I were being watched, though the parking lot appeared completely deserted. The main building's windows glowed warmly, promising the comfort of human presence. But out here in the far corner of the lot, the darkness seemed deeper, more complete. As I backed into the space with practiced precision, my side mirrors caught something that made me pause. For just a moment in the reflection, I could have sworn I saw other trucks, dozens of them filling spaces that didn't exist. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing but empty asphalt stretching away into the rain-soaked night. I rubbed my eyes, attributing the vision to exhaustion and the disorienting effect of water streaming down my mirrors. The engine shuddered to silence, and suddenly the world became very quiet. Even the rain seemed to soften, no longer drumming against my cab with its earlier intensity. I sat in my driver's seat for a moment, listening to the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal and feeling that particular loneliness that comes to truckers in the small hours of the morning. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of the truck stop's electrical systems and the occasional drip of water from my mirror brackets. I gathered my jacket and wallet, preparing to make the long walk across the wet parking lot to the main building. The distance seemed greater now that I was parked so far away, and I found myself wondering about the logic of placing the only truck parking space in such an isolated location. Surely it would make more sense to have it closer to the building, more convenient for drivers who needed rest and sustenance. The rain picked up again as I stepped down from my cab, immediately soaking through my jacket and sending cold rivulets down my neck. The asphalt was slick beneath my boots, and the neon lights from the truck stop created strange, shifting patterns on the wet surface as I walked. Each step echoed oddly in the empty space, the sound seeming to bounce and multiply in ways that defied the open environment. Halfway to the building, I turned back to check on my truck, a habit ingrained by years of protecting my livelihood from theft and vandalism. What I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. My truck was there, exactly where I'd left it, but the lone parking space now appeared to be one of dozens. The entire lot stretched behind my Peterbilt, filled with the ghostly outlines of other trucks, their form shifting and wavering like heat mirages despite the cold rain. I blinked hard, squeezing my eyes shut and opening them again. The vision persisted for several heartbeats. A massive truck stop parking lot filled to capacity with rigs of every make and model, some looking decades old, their chrome dulled and paint faded. I could almost hear the idle of their engines, smell the diesel exhaust mixing with the rain-washed air. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the illusion faded, leaving only my solitary truck in its single designated space. My heart hammered against my ribs as I continued toward the building, telling myself it was nothing more than exhaustion playing tricks with my perception. Truck drivers often experienced hallucinations when pushed too far without sleep, and I'd been on the road longer than usual. The rational explanation should have been comforting, but something deep in my gut suggested this was different, something beyond the normal effects of fatigue. The interior of the truck stop was exactly what I'd expected: harsh fluorescent lighting, rows of snacks and trucking supplies, a small restaurant area with vinyl booths and the perpetual smell of coffee that had been brewing too long. A single clerk stood behind the counter, a young woman with tired eyes and the patient expression of someone accustomed to working the graveyard shift. She looked up as I entered, water still dripping from my jacket onto the worn linoleum floor. "Rough night to be on the road," she said, her voice carrying the flat accent of the Arkansas Delta. "You're the first truck we've seen in hours." I approached the counter, still trying to shake off the unsettling vision from the parking lot. "Strange setup you've got here," I said, attempting to keep my tone casual. "Only one truck parking space." The clerk's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a shadow crossing her features so quickly I might have imagined it. "Oh, you parked in the space," she said, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before, a careful neutrality that suggested she was choosing her words with unusual precision. "Well, yeah, it's the only one available." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the windows that looked out onto the parking lot. "Most truckers see it and decide to move on. Find another place to stop." She paused, seeming to weigh whether to continue. "You planning to sleep here tonight?" The question struck me as odd, loaded with implications I couldn't quite grasp. "That was the plan. Why? Is there something wrong with the space?" Instead of answering directly, she turned to prepare a cup of coffee, her movements deliberate and careful. "Coffee's fresh," she said, handing me the steaming cup. "On the house. You might want to drink it quick, though. Most folks don't stay parked out there very long." I accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping my cold hands around the warm ceramic. The liquid was bitter but welcome, and I felt some of the chill leaving my bones. "What do you mean they don't stay long? What happens?" The clerk glanced around the empty store as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned slightly across the counter. "That space has been here since this truck stop opened 43 years ago. Always just the one. Story goes that the original owner had a vision when he was planning the lot, saw exactly where it should go, how many spaces he needed. Everyone thought he was crazy, building a truck stop with parking for just one rig, but he insisted that's all there was ever supposed to be." She paused, straightening bottles of aspirin on the counter with nervous energy. "Thing is, over the years, drivers have reported seeing other trucks out there. Whole parking lots full of them. especially on nights like this when the weather's bad and the light plays tricks. Some say they're the ghosts of truckers who died on the road, all trying to find a place to rest. The coffee suddenly tasted more bitter, and I found myself glancing toward the rain-streaked windows. And what do you think? I think there's a lot we don't understand about the road, about the places where travelers stop to rest. I think some spaces hold on to things, memories maybe, or something deeper. She met my eyes directly. The cargo I can't forget, from Marcus Delacroix. The smell hit me first, even before I saw the rig parked under those sickly yellow truck stop lights outside Bakersfield. It was 3:15 in the morning, and the desert air should have been clean and cold, but instead it carried this nauseating stench that made my stomach clench like a fist. Burning hair, thick and acrid, the kind of smell that gets into your sinuses and stays there for days. I'd been driving for 18 years, hauling everything from cattle to chemicals, and I knew that particular odor meant trouble somewhere down the line. The truck itself was a beauty, I'll give it that. A midnight blue Peterbilt 389 with chrome so polished it reflected the neon signs like mirrors, sitting there humming with that distinctive purr of a well-tuned Caterpillar engine. The trailer was a standard 53-footer, unmarked and sealed tight, but something about the way it sat there in the fluorescent glow made my skin crawl. The cab was dark except for the running lights, and I couldn't see anyone inside, but the engine was definitely running. Diesel exhaust mixing with that horrible burning smell until I had to breathe through my mouth. I was nursing my third cup of coffee in the diner when the driver walked in, and I knew immediately he belonged to that blue Peterbilt. He was tall and gaunt, with skin that looked like old leather and eyes that seemed too bright in the harsh overhead lighting. His hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite what must have been hours on the road, and his clothes were pressed and clean in a way that seemed almost unnatural for someone who'd been driving through the night. When he sat down at the counter, 3 stools away from where I was reading my logbook, that burning hair smell intensified until I had to fight not to gag. The waitress, a tired-looking woman named Dolores according to her name tag, approached him with the kind of practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She set down a menu and asked what she could get him, but he just shook his head slowly and ordered black coffee. Nothing else. His voice was soft and measured, with an accent I couldn't quite place, something that might have been southern but felt older somehow, like it belonged to a different century entirely. When Dolores brought his cup, I noticed his hands were perfectly smooth. No calluses or scars, despite what should have been years of handling steering wheels and loading equipment. I tried to focus on my paperwork, calculating drive time and mandatory rest periods, but I kept stealing glances at him in the mirror behind the counter. He sat perfectly still, both hands wrapped around his coffee cup, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. The smell of burning hair seemed to pulse with his breathing, getting stronger and weaker in waves that made my eyes water. Other drivers in the diner kept shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and I noticed more than one of them finished their meals quickly and left without their usual lingering conversation. When I finally gathered the courage to look directly at him, he was already looking back at me with those unnaturally bright eyes. He smiled, and his teeth were too white and too straight, like perfect porcelain in a face that belonged in a funeral parlor. He raised his coffee cup in a small salute and spoke just loud enough for me to hear over the hum of the overhead, fans and the distant sound of trucks pulling in and out of the parking lot. Beautiful night for driving, wouldn't you say, friend? Clear skies, empty roads, nothing but time and distance ahead of us. The way he said it made it sound less like casual conversation and more like an invitation, and something deep in my gut told me to finish my coffee and get back to my own rig as quickly as possible. But then he mentioned my route, somehow knowing I was headed north on the 5 towards Sacramento, and when I asked how he could possibly know that, he just smiled wider and tapped his temple with one perfectly manicured finger. You develop a sense for these things after enough years on the road. We're kindred spirits, you and I, bound by the same calling to keep moving, to keep hauling our cargo from one place to another, no matter what that cargo might be. The way he emphasized the word cargo made my skin crawl, and I found myself asking what he was hauling in that unmarked trailer. His smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes, something cold and ancient that made me wish I'd kept my mouth shut. He leaned closer, and the burning hair smell became almost overwhelming, mixed now with something else, something sweet and rotten that reminded me of flowers left too long in a hot car. "Special delivery," he whispered, "for people who've been waiting a very long time. Some cargo is more precious than others, you understand. Some loads require a personal touch." He straightened up and finished his coffee in one long swallow, then placed a $20 bill on the counter next to his empty cup. As he stood to leave, he placed one of those smooth, cold hands on my shoulder, and I felt a chill that went straight through my jacket and into my bones. "Perhaps we'll see each other on the road," he said, "fellow travelers sharing the same lonely highway. There's comfort in knowing you're not the only one out there in the dark, carrying your burden from place to place." Then he was gone, walking out into the parking lot with steps that seemed too quiet for boots on gravel, leaving nothing behind but that lingering smell and the memory of his unnatural smile. I sat there for another 10 minutes, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me like a heavy blanket, but when I finally walked outside to my own truck, I could see his Peterbilt pulling out onto the highway, heading north just like he'd somehow known I would be. The running lights disappeared into the distance, but that smell lingered in the air, stronger now, as if it had somehow attached itself to me during our brief conversation. My own rig felt like a sanctuary as I climbed into the cab and started the engine, the familiar rumble of the Detroit diesel drowning out the silence that had followed his departure. I pulled out of the truck stop and merged onto the interstate, telling myself that encounters with strange drivers were just part of life on the road, that everyone had their quirks and oddities after enough years of hauling freight across the country. But 20 miles north of Bakersfield, I saw his running lights in the distance, and no matter how I adjusted my speed, they stayed exactly the same distance ahead of me. When I slowed down, they seemed to slow down too. When I pressed harder on the accelerator, trying to close the gap or fall further behind, they maintained that same precise distance, as if we were connected by some invisible chain that kept us locked in formation. The smell began seeping into my cab around midnight, despite my air conditioning being on recirculate and all the windows sealed tight. It started as just a faint whiff of burning hair, barely noticeable over the diesel fumes and road dust, but it grew stronger with each passing mile until I had to crack my window despite the cold night air rushing in. Even then, it seemed to cling to everything, settling into my clothes and hair like smoke from a campfire. Near Fresno, I tried to break the pattern by taking an exit for fuel, but as I pulled into the truck plaza, I could see his blue Peterbilt already parked at the far end of the lot, engine running, cab dark. The smell was so strong now that other drivers walking past his trailer covered their noses and hurried toward the building, and I noticed the lot attendant kept his distance when he walked his rounds. I filled my tanks as quickly as possible and got back on the highway, but when I merged into traffic, there he was again, maintaining that same impossible distance ahead of me. As dawn approached and the eastern sky began to show the first hints of gray, I realized we were approaching Sacramento, and something told me that whatever game we'd been playing through the night was about to end. His running lights began moving closer, and for the first time in hours, the distance between us was changing. I could see his trailer more clearly now, and I noticed wet stains running down the back doors. Dark streaks that hadn't been there at the truck stop in Bakersfield. The smell became so overwhelming that I had to pull over at a rest area just south of the city, gasping for fresh air and trying not to vomit on the side of the highway. As I stood outside my cab, hands on my knees, struggling to breathe clean air, I heard the distinctive sound of his Peterbilt pulling into the rest area behind me. The engine shut off, and for the first time since we'd met, everything was completely silent except for the distant hum of early morning traffic. I turned around slowly, knowing somehow that he would be standing there waiting for me. And I was right. He stood beside his truck with that same unnatural smile. But now I could see that his perfect hair was singed around the edges, and his two bright eyes reflected the orange glow of the sunrise like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. The Lullaby Road, from Marcus. I've been driving long haul for 17 years, and in all that time I thought I'd heard every possible sound a CB radio could make. Static bursts that sound like screaming wind, phantom voices bleeding through from distant stations, even the occasional late-night confession from some lonesome driver halfway across the country. But I'd never heard one that only sang nursery rhymes until I picked up that old Kenworth from the auction yard outside Bakersfield. The truck itself was solid enough. A 1987 model with over 1 million miles on her, but still purring like a satisfied cat when I fired up that Caterpillar engine. The previous owner had passed away, according to the auctioneer, and his family just wanted the rig gone. They'd priced it to sell, which should have been my first warning. In this business, when something seems too good to be true, it usually comes with problems you can't see until you're already committed. I was hauling a load of electronics from California to Atlanta, a familiar run that would take me through the desert Southwest and across Texas before hitting the humid roads of the Deep South. The CB radio worked fine during the daylight hours, crackling with the usual chatter from other drivers sharing information about speed traps, construction delays, and the best truck stops for coffee and pie. Nothing unusual there. Just the comforting background noise that makes those long stretches of highway feel less empty. It was somewhere outside Flagstaff when the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the Arizona sky in shades of orange and purple that never failed to remind me why I loved this job despite its hardships. The temperature was dropping with the sun, and I'd cranked up the heater just enough to keep the cab comfortable. That's when the CB first started acting strange. The normal chatter began to fade around 8 in the evening, replaced by an unusual silence that seemed to press against the inside of the cab like a physical presence. I tried reaching out to other drivers on Channel 19, but my calls went unanswered, swallowed up by static that sounded almost musical in its rhythm. Then, just as I was considering switching the radio off entirely, a voice emerged from the speakers so clearly it might have been sitting right beside me in the passenger seat. "Rock-a-bye, baby." In the treetop, the voice sang, sweet and melodious like a mother singing to her child. "When the wind blows, the cradle will rock." I keyed the mic, trying to raise whoever was broadcasting. "Hey there, driver, you've got your channel mixed up. This here's 19 for truckers." But the voice continued without pause, finishing the lullaby with perfect pitch and timing before falling silent again. The static returned, but now it seemed to pulse with an underlying rhythm that made my skin crawl. For the next hour, as I navigated the winding mountain roads east of Flagstaff, the CB remained mercifully quiet. I convinced myself it had just been some kid playing with their parents' radio, though something about the voice nagged at me. It had sounded too mature to be a child, too polished to be an amateur, and there had been something else underneath the sweetness that I couldn't quite identify. The voice returned as I descended into the high desert, emerging from the static like a swimmer surfacing from dark water. This time it was Mary, Mary, quite contrary, sung with the same pristine clarity and that same underlying quality that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. I tried changing channels, spinning the dial through the full range of CB frequencies, but the voice followed me everywhere, never missing a note or stumbling over a word. As the night deepened and the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, illuminated only by my headlights and the occasional glimmer of starlight, the nursery rhymes continued. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, drifted through the cab as I passed a rest area where several other trucks sat parked with their running lights glowing like earthbound constellations. I considered stopping to ask if any of the other drivers were picking up the same transmission, but something kept me moving forward, as if stopping would somehow make whatever was happening more real. The voice sang Three Blind Mice as I crossed into New Mexico, the melody echoing strangely in the cab's confines. By now, I'd noticed that the songs seemed to be getting darker, or perhaps I was just hearing them differently as my unease grew. The farmer's wife cutting off the mice's tails with a carving knife took on a sinister quality when sung in that perfect, emotionless voice that never wavered or showed any sign of human frailty. I pulled into a truck stop outside Gallup around midnight, hoping that shutting off the engine would end whatever was happening with the radio. The parking lot was half full of sleeping rigs, their drivers catching mandatory rest breaks or simply escaping the road for a few precious hours. I climbed down from the cab, my legs stiff from hours of driving, and walked into the bright fluorescent warmth of the truck stop restaurant. The waitress was friendly enough, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who'd probably been serving coffee to truckers for most of her adult life. I ordered coffee and pie, more for the human contact than from hunger, and casually asked if she'd heard any strange radio transmissions lately. She shook her head, looking at me with the sort of concern usually reserved for drivers who'd been on the road too long without proper rest. "You getting enough sleep, honey?" she asked, refilling my cup with coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Sometimes when folks get too tired, they start hearing things that aren't really there. I assured her I was fine, paid my bill, and walked back out into the desert night. The cold air was sharp in my lungs, carrying scents of sage and dust that should have been comforting in their familiarity. Instead, I felt watched, though the parking lot appeared empty except for the sleeping trucks and the distant glow of the interstate. Back in the cab, I sat for a moment before starting the engine, hoping against hope that whatever had been wrong with the radio had somehow fixed itself during my break. But as soon as I turned the key and the electrical systems came to life, the voice returned, clearer than ever. "London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down." It sang with mechanical precision. "London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady." This time, though, I noticed something else. In the brief pauses between verses, I could hear breathing that wasn't quite right, too steady and measured to be natural. It reminded me of the sound hospital ventilators make, that artificial rhythm that keeps life moving when the body can no longer manage on its own. I pulled back onto the interstate with the voice for company, trying to focus on the road ahead while nursery rhyme after nursery rhyme filled the cab. Jack and Jill went up the hill, became a tale of inevitable disaster, while Ring Around the Rosie took on the character of a funeral dirge when sung in that emotionless tone. The miles passed in a haze of mounting dread as the voice never tired, never faltered, never showed any sign that there was an actual person behind the transmission. Somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, as dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, I finally understood what had been bothering me about the voice. It wasn't just that it never wavered or showed emotion. It was that it sounded exactly like the CB radio speaker itself had learned to sing, as if the electronic components had somehow developed the ability to produce music instead of just reproducing it. The realization hit me as the voice began, "The itsy bitsy spider," and I noticed that the words seemed to be coming from the radio, even when no one was transmitting. The channel indicator showed nothing, no signal strength, no indication of an incoming broadcast, yet the voice continued with perfect clarity. It was as if the radio itself had become possessed by some electronic ghost that knew only children's songs. I tried turning the radio off, but the voice continued regardless of the power setting. I tried unplugging it entirely, yanking the power cord from its socket behind the dashboard, but still the voice sang on, now accompanied by a soft electronic humming that seemed to come from the radio's darkened display. The nursery rhymes had become a part of the truck itself, woven into its electrical system like a virus in a computer. As the sun climbed higher and traffic began to increase on the interstate, I found myself singing along without conscious thought, my voice joining that mechanical melody in harmonies I'd never learned. Old MacDonald Had a Farm became a duet between man and machine, and I realized with growing horror that I couldn't stop myself from participating. The songs had gotten into my head, taken root there like some kind of auditory parasite that fed on repetition and routine. I made it to a truck stop outside Amarillo before I trusted myself to pull over, my hands shaking as I climbed down from the cab. The constellation that wasn't from Marcus. The headlights of my Peterbilt had been pointing toward the heavens for 3 hours now, and I still couldn't figure out why that bothered me so much. Maybe it was the way they cut through the darkness like searchlights hunting for something that shouldn't be found. Or maybe it was because every other trucker who'd passed my broken-down rig had slowed to stare before speeding away without offering help. The front axle had snapped clean through on this godforsaken stretch of Nevada highway, leaving my cab tilted at such an angle that my headlight beams shot straight up into the star-drunk sky instead of illuminating the cracked asphalt ahead. I'd called for a tow truck hours ago, but out here in the absolute middle of nowhere, between Tonopah and whatever ghost town lay beyond the next ridge, help moved at the speed of geology. The dispatcher had promised someone would come eventually, but eventually felt like a word that had lost all meaning in this desert wasteland where time seemed to pool in the low places like winter snow. My CB radio crackled with distant conversations between drivers hundreds of miles away, their voices threading through the static like whispers from another dimension, but none of them were close enough to matter. The September air carried a chill that surprised me, desert nights having their own rules about temperature that city folks never understood. I'd killed the engine an hour back to save diesel, and now the silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water. The only sounds were the occasional tick of cooling metal and the soft whisper of wind across the highway, a sound that reminded me uncomfortably of someone trying to get my attention from very far away. Above me, the Milky Way sprawled across the sky with an intensity that made me dizzy when I looked up too long. All those countless stars burning their ancient light down on my tilted truck. That's when I first noticed something odd about the patch of sky my headlights were illuminating. The beams reached maybe 300 feet up before they dispersed into nothing, but in that cone of light the stars looked different somehow. Brighter maybe, or arranged in patterns that seemed almost familiar, like a half-remembered song hummed by someone in the next room. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel shoulder, and stood behind my truck to get a better look at what my headlights were doing to the night sky above. The effect was subtle at first, like trying to see a shape in clouds, but the longer I stared, the more convinced I became that my headlight beams were somehow organizing the stars they touched, not moving them exactly, but highlighting certain ones while casting others into relative darkness, creating what looked like a vast connect-the-dots puzzle stretched across the cosmos. I found myself tracing lines between the illuminated stars with my eyes, following patterns that suggested geometric shapes too complex and precise to be coincidental. The hair on the back of my neck began to prickle with the kind of electricity that comes before summer thunderstorms. A truck approached from the east, its own headlights sweeping across the desert like lighthouse beams, and I flagged it down with desperate waves, grateful for any human contact in this vast emptiness. The driver, a weathered man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, pulled his Kenworth onto the shoulder and climbed down to survey my situation. He introduced himself as Earl, said he'd been running this route for 23 years and had seen every kind of breakdown the desert could dish out. But when he looked up at my headlight beams cutting through the night sky, his expression shifted from helpful concern to something approaching unease. "That's different," he said quietly, adjusting his glasses as if that might change what he was seeing. "Never seen lights do that to the stars before. Makes them look almost like they're spelling something out, doesn't it?" His voice carried the careful tone of a man trying to convince himself he wasn't seeing what he thought he was seeing. We stood there together in the desert silence, two small figures dwarfed by the enormous night, staring up at the constellation my broken truck had accidentally created with its misaligned headlights. Earl offered to radio for additional help, maybe expedite my tow truck situation, But then his CB started crackling with an urgent voice that made both of us freeze. The voice was reporting strange lights in the sky, moving lights that seemed to be responding to truckers' headlight beams all along Highway 6. Other drivers began chiming in, their voices tight with confusion and growing alarm, describing stars that pulsed and shifted when illuminated by their rigs' lights, patterns in the sky that seemed to be spreading from truck to truck like some kind of celestial infection. "I need to get out of here," Earl said suddenly, backing toward his cab with quick, nervous steps. "This whole thing, whatever it is, it's not natural. Those lights up there, they're doing something to the stars. And I don't want to be around when whatever's happening decides to happen faster." He climbed into his truck with movements that bordered on panic. And despite my situation, despite being stranded in the middle of nowhere with a broken axle, I found myself nodding in agreement. Some instinct deeper than rational thought was screaming at me to turn off those headlights, to stop feeding whatever hunger had awakened in the sky above. But when I tried to start my engine to kill the lights, nothing happened. The battery was strong. The starter turned over with its usual determination, but the diesel engine remained stubbornly silent. I tried again and again, pumping the accelerator and adjusting the choke, performing all the small rituals that sometimes coax life from reluctant machinery. But my Peterbilt had decided to sleep. The headlights continued their upward vigil, powered by the battery that seemed strangely unaffected by their drain, illuminating that same patch of sky where the stars were growing brighter and more purposeful in their arrangements. Earl's departure left me alone, with the growing certainty that something monumental was building in the darkness above my head. The CB radio chattered constantly now with reports from drivers across Nevada and into California, all describing the same phenomenon: stars that responded to truck headlights, patterns that emerged from the chaos of the cosmos when illuminated by the right kind of light from the right kind of angle. Some drivers reported that the patterns were moving, rotating slowly like the hands of an enormous clock, while others swore they could hear a low humming sound that seemed to come from the sky itself. As midnight approached, marked by the digital clock on my dashboard that glowed with reassuring mundanity, the stars within my headlight beams began to pulse in unison, their light strengthening and dimming in a rhythm that reminded me of breathing, or perhaps a massive heartbeat. The pattern was hypnotic, and I found myself swaying slightly as I watched, my consciousness drifting in and out of focus, like a radio trying to lock onto a distant signal. The desert around me seemed to fade into insignificance, leaving only the truck, the lights, the stars, and the growing sensation that I had become part of some vast communication system that stretched across the universe. Then I saw it descending through my headlight beams, something that wasn't quite light and wasn't quite matter, flowing downward like luminous smoke with purpose and intelligence behind its movement. It moved through the cone of illumination with the fluid grace of something that belonged neither to earth nor sky, its form shifting and changing as it approached my truck. My rational mind insisted it was an optical illusion, a trick of tired eyes and desert air, but my body was already moving toward the cab, every survival instinct I possessed screaming at me to break whatever connection my headlights had established with the cosmic array above. The tow truck arrived, at that moment like a miracle, wrapped in diesel exhaust and flashing yellow lights. Its driver, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah, who took one look at my situation and immediately began setting up her equipment. She worked with efficient speed, barely glancing at the light show above us, her attention focused entirely on the practical problem of getting my Peterbilt back on level ground. "Seen a lot of weird stuff out here at night," she said when I tried to explain about the stars and the patterns and the thing that had been descending through my headlight beams. "Desert plays tricks on your mind, especially when you've been stranded for hours. Let's get you pointed in the right direction again." Within 20 minutes, Sarah had my truck level and my headlights pointing back toward the horizon where they belonged. The stars above returned to their normal, random brilliance, no longer arranged in patterns that suggested meaning or purpose. The CB radio fell silent except for the usual late-night chatter about traffic and weather and truck stop coffee. Everything returned to normal so quickly and completely that I almost convinced myself that exhaustion and isolation had created the whole experience from desert air and starlight. But as Sarah finished her work and prepared to leave, she handed me a business card and said quietly, "If this happens again, call me directly, not the dispatch." There are places along this highway where the night gets confused about what it's supposed to be, and sometimes vehicles become part of that confusion. The Midnight Parade, from Marcus Chen. The radio crackled to life at midnight as I guided my Peterbilt down the rain-slicked asphalt of Highway 34, somewhere between the forgotten towns of Millfield and Cedar Hollow. Static filled the cab before clearing into the familiar voice of dispatch. Though tonight Sarah sounded different, her words carrying an edge I'd never heard in our 3 years of late-night conversations. "Marcus, you still out there on 34? Her voice wavered slightly through the speaker, mixing with the steady drumming of rain against my windshield. I reached for the CB, adjusting my grip on the wheel as a gust of wind rocked the trailer. "Copy dispatch. About 20 miles east of Millfield. Making good time despite this weather. Everything all right, Sarah?" The pause stretched longer than it should have, filled only by the rhythmic thump of my wipers and the low rumble of the Detroit diesel beneath the hood. When Sarah's voice returned, it carried a note of confusion that made my chest tighten. "Marcus, I need you to keep your eyes open out there. We've been getting some strange reports from other drivers on your route. Something about a convoy of cabs, all empty, running parallel to the highway." I squinted through the rain-streaked glass, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. The landscape rolled away on either side in gentle hills dotted with farmhouses, their windows dark at this late hour. Nothing moved except the swaying branches of oak trees bending under the storm's weight. "Haven't seen anything unusual, dispatch. Just me and the rain out here. What kind of reports are we talking about?" Another pause, longer this time. In the background, I could hear the faint chatter of other radio communications, voices overlapping in urgent whispers that I couldn't quite make out. Sarah cleared her throat before responding. 3 drivers in the past hour, Marcus. All of them reported seeing a line of taxi cabs driving on back roads that run alongside 34. Empty cabs, no passengers, no drivers that anyone could see clearly. The strange part is they're all keeping pace with whatever truck spots them, maintaining the same speed, staying just visible through the tree line. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. My eyes swept the darkness to my right, where County Road 15 should be running roughly parallel to the highway, separated by perhaps half a mile of fields and scattered woodland. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the landscape in brief, stark snapshots of silver and black. That's some creative storytelling, dispatch. These guys pulling a long haul. That's just it, Marcus. None of them were tired. None of them had been driving more than 6 hours. And the descriptions matched too closely to be coincidence. Yellow cabs, older models, maybe from the 80s or 90s, moving in perfect formation like they're following some kind of route. I pressed the accelerator slightly, feeling the need to put some distance between myself and whatever strangeness my fellow drivers had encountered. The speedometer climbed to 75, then 80, the maximum I dared push in these conditions. Rain hammered the cab with renewed intensity, and I reached over to turn up the heat, though the warmth did little to ease the growing uneasiness in my stomach. The miles rolled by in monotonous succession, marked only by the occasional flash of a mile marker caught in my headlight beams. I found myself checking the right side mirrors more frequently than usual, scanning for any sign of movement in the fields beyond the guardrail. The radio remained quiet except for the soft hiss of static and Sarah's occasional check-ins with other drivers working the night shift. It was 20 minutes later when I first saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, creating shapes in the shifting patterns of rain and shadow. But as I crested a low hill, lightning illuminated the landscape again, and there they were, unmistakable in that brief moment of clarity. A line of vehicles moving through the darkness on what had to be County Road 15, their headlights cutting pale swaths through the storm. I counted 5, maybe 6 vehicles before the lightning faded and plunged the world back into darkness. My heart began to beat faster as I realized they were indeed keeping pace with my truck, maintaining a steady speed that matched my own despite the winding nature of the county road. Dispatch, this is Marcus. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I've got visual on those vehicles, the other drivers reported. Confirm 6 vehicles running parallel on County Road 15, maintaining speed with my position. Sarah's response came immediately. Copy, Marcus.
Can you make out what type of vehicles they are?
I strained my eyes, waiting for another lightning flash. When it came, the brief illumination confirmed what I had hoped I wouldn't see. The distinctive shape of taxicabs, their roof lights dark but unmistakable, moving in a perfect procession through the rain. Even from this distance, something about their movement seemed wrong. Too precise, too synchronized. Confirmed, dispatch. 6 taxicabs, yellow, older models like you said. They're running dark except for headlights, no interior lighting that I can see. Are you able to see the drivers? I focused intently during the next lightning flash, trying to make out details through the rain and distance. The cabs continued their ghostly parade, but despite my best efforts, I couldn't distinguish any human figures behind the windshields. The vehicles seemed to move with purpose, but that purpose appeared divorced from human control. Negative on drivers, dispatch. Too far away and too dark to make out details, but I'm not seeing any clear indication of occupants. The convoy maintained its parallel course for another 10 miles, always visible during the brief moments when lightning illuminated the landscape, always keeping perfect pace with my truck despite the curves and hills that should have made such synchronization impossible. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white in the dashboard lights. Then, without warning, the county road began to curve toward the highway. I checked my GPS and felt my stomach drop. A mile ahead, County Road 15 would intersect with Highway 34 at a traffic light that controlled access to a small truck stop. The empty convoy was going to cross my path. Dispatch, I've got a situation developing here. County Road 15 intersects with my route in about a mile. Those cabs are going to cross the highway right in front of me. Sarah's voice carried new urgency. Marcus, I want you to pull over before you reach that intersection. Do not attempt to interact with those vehicles. But even as she spoke, I could see that pulling over wasn't going to be an option. The highway narrowed here, with concrete barriers on both sides as it passed through a small valley. There was nowhere to stop, nowhere to wait. I was committed to reaching that intersection, and the convoy of empty cabs was committed to crossing it. I eased off the accelerator, dropping my speed to 60, then 55, hoping to delay the inevitable meeting. But as I did, I noticed something that made my hands tremble on the wheel. The headlights visible through the tree line slowed as well, matching my reduced speed with unnatural precision. The intersection appeared around a curve, its traffic light a lonely beacon of red and green cycling through its programmed sequence in the middle of nowhere. The small truck stop sat dark and closed, its parking lot empty except for puddles reflecting the neon signs. As I approached, I could see County Road 15 stretching away into the darkness on both sides of the highway. The light was green as I neared the intersection, but I found myself slowing further, some instinct warning me against proceeding. Through my passenger side window, I caught glimpses of the approaching convoy through breaks in the tree line. They were closer now, close enough that I should have been able to hear their engines over the sound of rain and my own diesel rumble. But I heard nothing except silence from their direction. The lead cab emerged from the tree line just as I entered the intersection, and for a moment that stretched like an eternity. We were parallel, separated by perhaps 30 feet of rain-soaked asphalt. In that moment, with my headlights illuminating the side of the vehicle, I could see through its windows clearly. The cab was empty. Not just of passengers, but of everything that should have been there. No driver, no seat where a driver should sit, no dashboard, no steering wheel that I could make out. The interior appeared to be filled with a soft gray light that seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat made visible. The second cab followed, then the third, each one revealing the same impossible emptiness. They moved with mechanical precision, their engines silent, their wheels rolling over the wet pavement without the splash and spray that should have accompanied their passage. As each vehicle crossed in front of me, I caught a glimpse of that same gray pulsing light where the interior should have been. The engine that cracks stone, from Marcus Holloway. I've been driving long haul for 37 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of rig that could roll down these endless highways. Chrome stacks that gleam like church spires, custom paint jobs that cost more than most folks' houses, engines that rumble with the deep satisfaction of perfectly tuned machinery, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I encountered on that fog-shrouded stretch of Interstate 80 through the Nevada desert, where the only company you usually find is the occasional coyote and the distant hum of power lines cutting through the darkness. It was past 3 in the morning, that dead hour when the world feels suspended between one day and the next, when even the most seasoned drivers start seeing shadows that shouldn't be there, and hearing voices in the white noise of road wind. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Sacramento to Denver, my faithful Peterbilt 379 eating up the miles with a steady rhythm that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. The CB radio had been quiet for hours, just the occasional burst of static or the distant murmur of another driver fighting off sleep with coffee and conversation. The fog had rolled in around midnight, thick and peculiar, not the usual desert mist that burns off with the first hint of dawn, but something heavier, more persistent. It clung to my windshield like cobwebs, and my headlights seemed to die just a few yards beyond my bumper, swallowed up by that gray-white wall that made the familiar highway feel like an alien landscape. I'd slowed considerably, my usual 70 reduced to a cautious 45, my hands gripping the steering wheel with the kind of tension that comes from driving blind through a world that suddenly feels hostile and unknown. That's when I first heard it, cutting through the steady drone of my own diesel engine like a blade through silk. Another truck, somewhere ahead of me in that impenetrable mist, but its engine note was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the familiar rumble of a Cummins or the distinctive growl of a Caterpillar. This sound was deeper, more primal, a bass note that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the earth. Each pulse of that distant engine sent tremors through my truck's cab, rattling my coffee cup in its holder and making my dashboard instruments flutter like nervous birds. At first, I thought it might be some kind of modified racing engine, one of those custom builds that weekend warriors use to show off at truck rallies. But as the minutes passed and that rhythmic pounding continued, I began to notice something else. The pavement itself seemed to be responding to the sound, small cracks appearing in my peripheral vision, spiderwebbing out from the center line in patterns that defied explanation. I told myself it was just the fog playing tricks with my vision. That 37 years of highway driving had finally caught up with my tired eyes. The CB crackled to life, a voice distorted by static and something else, something that made the words sound hollow and far away. "Eastbound, you getting this?" the voice asked, and I could hear the uncertainty, the fear barely contained beneath the professional trucker's dialect. Something ain't right with that rig up ahead. I keyed my mic, grateful for the human contact in that strange, isolated world. "Yeah, I hear it," I responded, my own voice sounding smaller than I'd intended. "What kind of engine makes a sound like that?" "Been trying to figure that out for the last 20 miles, came the reply. "Followed him out of Reno, but I can't get close enough to see what he's running. Every time I try to pass, it's like the road itself starts coming apart. As if summoned by our conversation, the fog ahead began to thin slightly, and I caught my first glimpse of taillights, red dots floating in the mist like the eyes of some massive creature. The truck they belonged to was massive, larger than any commercial vehicle I'd seen on the roads, its silhouette strange and somehow wrong. as if it had been designed by someone who understood the function of a truck but not quite the proper proportions. The engine sound intensified as I drew closer, and now I could see what the other driver had meant about the road coming apart. With each thunderous pulse of that impossible engine, the asphalt cracked and buckled. Not just surface damage, but deep fissures that seemed to reach down into the bedrock itself. Steam rose from these cracks, carrying with it a smell of sulfur and heated stone that made my eyes water and my throat burn. I tried to change lanes, to give the strange vehicle more room, but as soon as I began my maneuver, the cracks in the asphalt spread outward like a spider's web, forcing me back into line behind the mysterious rig. The truck ahead seemed to grow larger as I watched, its trailer stretching impossibly long, its exhaust stacks reaching up into the fog like the smokestacks of some mobile factory. The CB erupted with panicked voices, drivers reporting similar encounters all along the interstate. "It's like the whole highway is splitting apart," one voice reported. "Whatever that thing is running, it's not meant for these roads." Another driver, his transmission weak with distance, claimed to have seen sparks shooting from the truck's exhaust. Not the usual orange shower of diesel particulates, but blue-white arcs that looked more like electrical discharge than combustion byproducts. I tried to fall back, to put some distance between myself and the road-cracking monster ahead, but every time I reduced speed, the truck seemed to slow as well, matching my pace with mechanical precision. Its taillights pulsed in rhythm with the engine, and I began to realize that they weren't reflecting my headlights at all, but generating their own crimson glow, a light that seemed to penetrate the fog with unnatural clarity. The temperature gauge on my dashboard began to climb, though my engine was running perfectly, and I could feel heat radiating through the floor of my cab, as if the very earth beneath the highway was warming up. The cracks in the asphalt were wider now, some large enough that I had to swerve to avoid them, and through the gaps I could see a faint red glow, like coals buried deep in the ground. That's when the truck ahead of me began to change. Its outline wavered in the fog, becoming less defined, more fluid, as if the intense heat of its engine was causing reality itself to distort around it. The trailer stretched and warped, its cargo doors morphing into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Geometries that my mind couldn't quite process. The exhaust stacks multiplied, or perhaps my vision was playing tricks. But suddenly there seemed to be dozens of them, all belching that sulfurous steam into the night air. The sound of the engine was overwhelming now, each pulse like a physical blow that made my chest tight and my vision blur. I fumbled for my CB radio, desperate to maintain some connection with the normal world, but the static was so intense that it sounded like the screaming of tortured metal. Through the white noise, I could barely make out fragments of transmissions. Other drivers reporting that their trucks were overheating, that their tires were beginning to smoke from the heat radiating up through the road surface. I made a decision that probably saved my life. At the next exit, a lonely off-ramp that led to nothing but desert scrub and abandoned gas stations, I yanked my steering wheel hard to the right, my trailer swaying dangerously as I fought to escape the gravitational pull of whatever was happening on the main highway. The truck ahead didn't follow, didn't even seem to notice my departure, just continued its steady eastward progress, leaving a trail of cracked asphalt and rising steam in its wake. From the overpass of that lonely exit, I watched as the impossible rig disappeared into the fog, its taillights fading like dying stars. The cracks in the highway continued to glow with that underground fire for several minutes after it passed, and I could swear I heard the sound of its engine long after it should have been beyond hearing range, a deep pulse that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself rather than from any mechanical source. I sat there for nearly an hour, my own engine idling quietly before I dared to return to the interstate. When I finally worked up the courage to rejoin the highway, the fog had lifted, revealing a perfectly normal stretch of asphalt with no signs of damage, no cracks, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Other trucks passed by at regular intervals, their drivers apparently oblivious to what had transpired just hours before. But I know what I saw, what I experienced, and sometimes late at night when I'm running through that same stretch of Nevada desert, I catch myself listening for that deep, earth-shaking pulse, watching for taillights that glow with their own hellish light. I've asked other drivers about similar encounters, spoken to mechanics about what kind of engine could generate such power, such impossible effects, but no one has any answers that make sense.